It says you're live.
Well, then we must be live.
Yeah.
We
I don't know. This is as much of an experiment as it is anything else.
so we're live, but we don't know if Pratik has let anybody in to see this.
Yeah.
So if you're looking out there, let us
Yeah.
know.
I'm gonna go check on LinkedIn to see what that looks like. Oh yeah, look. I see
Yeah.
us.
Okay. All right, looks we do have some people. All right, so who knew? I mean, Pratik is technology challenged, so
Yeah.
Thanks everybody. Welcome to our first and probably last ever Drunk Agile live episode. So we're just we these are the types of ideas that come up when you're just sitting around drinking, right? So it's like, hey, why not try to do one of these sober? So thanks everybody who has joined. With me as always, I've got my friend and colleague Pratik Singh. Pratik, I don't know, you want to say hi, say something a little bit about yourself?
Hi. I see a few folks. Andre, Joanna, Camille. Yeah. Hey, what people?
My name's Daniel Vicanti. Thanks everyone for joining. We thought we actually, as usual, we don't have any prepared remarks. We can certainly vamp for an hour if everybody wants us to, but we were hoping to start off with some questions from all of you. So if there's a particular topic that you'd like us to cover, if there's maybe something lately that we've said that's maybe been controversial, or maybe something that's not so controversial, let us know. Feel free to put it in the chat. I don't know, Pratik, do you have anything to get us going, to get us started?
I mean, I don't remember anything we've said that ever has been controversial. So
Never.
I doubt if there's anything. Well, I guess we could vamp for a little bit while questions pop up. This is typically how our Drunk Agile recordings go. We jump on, and for the first 5 minutes, we just go, "What do you want to talk about?"
Oh yeah, we've always threatened to do a Drunk Agile behind the scenes or whatever. This is about as behind the scenes as I think you can get. This is
pretty much.
This is pretty much it. Some things I've been thinking about lately. The difference between risk and uncertainty. I don't think that's very well understood out there. I mean, I think you and I had talked about queuing that up for a future Drunk Agile episode. Fitting, we've talked about, I think we've done this a few times in the past, talking about fitting your data to well-known probability distributions before you can use it in Monte Carlo. That just came up again last week. Maybe I'll say this. I'll start us off with some controversial comments. I think ignorance when it comes to Agile, or just any type of profession, I guess I could say, to me, ignorance is understandable and even reasonable. I mean, all of us have been ignorant at one point in our career, ignorant about something, ignorant about what we're doing with coding, ignorant about process or whatever. But when someone calls themselves an expert and then willfully demonstrates ignorance, for me, that's when it crosses over to stupidity, right? Do you care to comment, Pratik? This is something that's been on my mind a lot. How many Agile experts
for the past 25 years?
Yeah, exactly. How many people call themselves experts when they have no clue what they're talking about? And like I said, if you're ignorant, you're ignorant. I mean, nobody can be an expert in everything, but to call yourself an expert and then willfully demonstrate ignorance, that's unforgivable. What do you think?
Yeah, but I think there's a misconception, which is that if you are an expert, that expertise is easily transferable. Like, you're an expert in field A, it means that when you start talking about field B, you're automatically an expert in that. We're kind of seeing that with AI. Like, with people who had been offering classes, certifications, and all variety of things are randomly now offering AI certifications. I think it's the same thing. I think people assume because I have some sort of proven expertise in one area, I can talk like an expert about another area.
I think I think it's worse than that. See, this is where you're actually being nicer than me. That never happens, right? I I think it's worse than that. I took a statistics class once in college, and so therefore I am an expert on statistics. You know,
Yeah.
never mind you were taught all the wrong things. Never mind, how statistics is taught. In my opinion, how statistics is taught in university is all wrong. You had to go get. We were just talking about this before. Actually, you had to go get a data science degree to go kind of unlearn everything that you learned about statistics in your undergraduate
Yeah.
degree, right?
Yeah.
So. Um,
Yeah.
okay, I guess I don't know if anybody wants to hear more about that stuff. We can. That was just me kind of filling time and ranting because
Oh, Joanna loved that rant. Seems like.
Well, I wasn't talking about you, Joanna. By the way, you know that. Okay, let's go through some of these.
Yeah. There's a question
Theory
about why does
constraints.
Dan hate theory of constraints? Why, Dan? Why do you hate theory of
Why do you hate
constraints?
America, Dan? Why do you hate everything, Dan? Yeah. Okay. Theory of constraints. I have several reasons why I hate theory of constraints. Now, speaking of ignorance, I have to start this off by saying I am by no means a theory of constraints expert. I have read some stuff. I have experienced some stuff, but I am not what I would call a theory of constraints expert. I have, just in case everybody's wondering, full disclosure, I never finished The Goal. I hated that book, and I can't even put into words how much I hated that book. Didn't finish The Goal, but I have read most of all of Steve Tendon's stuff. So the things that I understand about theory of constraints really come more from Steve Tendon than Eli Goldratt. Although I did read Eli Goldratt's paper, "Standing on the Shoulders of Giants," which a lot of theory of constraints people like to kind of sweep under the rug because Goldratt says some things in there that theory of constraints people want to just forget, right?
Yeah, I think that's like at the end. He's included that at the end of The Goal. That's like the last chapter of The Goal as well.
Well,
Found.
a later version of The Goal, not the original version of The Goal.
Not
Right?
the
I think
original.
it was included. Anyway, so having said all that, my problem with the theory of constraints is that my understanding. This is my understanding, and if you're listening, please correct me. My understanding is the basics of the theory of constraints boils down to there is one constraint that you can spot in your system that by improving or removing or whatever that constraint will improve the overall performance of the whole system, right? So that's my basic understanding, which is fair enough. I mean, just if we just leave it at that sentence, if we leave it at that statement, it makes sense. It sounds reasonable. It's potentially even rational. The problem is when we talk about when we start introducing things, these pesky things like variation, right? How do you spot what that one constraint is? And I have received several answers about this from people over the years. The first answer I received about how do you spot the constraint is, the first answer I got was, well, it's a step in your workflow that has the lowest throughput. Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. Then I heard it's the step. I believe Steve Tendon says this, but again, please don't quote me on this but I'm pretty sure this is what he says. Steve Tendon says it's the step in your workflow with the highest average cycle time. If that's true, all of you know what I'm going to say to that. And then I've heard that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the step is. You can choose it. You can choose it to be whatever step you want it to be. Right? I've heard that as well. So let's take each of those in turn because I think they all boil down to the same argument. Well, maybe not the last one. Whether we're talking about throughput, and jump in anytime, Pratik. Don't just sit there and nod and smile.
Fun. Let's go. I'm just gonna, yeah.
So whether you say either the step with the lowest throughput or the step with the highest cycle time, how do you know? how do you know what step has the lowest throughput? And that might sound like a stupid question, but it's not. Pratik, you understand why that's not a stupid question, right? How do you know what step is your lowest throughput? How do you know what step is your? Yeah. How would you know, Pratik? How would you answer that question?
Yeah,
I'm looking at your process. Tell me what step has the lowest throughput.
well, I'm going to ask more leading questions, because how do you know over what period of time are you measuring that throughput? Is it instantaneous? Is it over the last 6 weeks? Is it over the last 6 months? Same
Right.
thing for cycle time.
Right.
As Joanna's asking, why would you even separate those steps?
Yeah.
Have you properly separated the steps, or do you need to? The, you, we often leave it up to the people managing the process to define the process.
Yeah.
If they've defined it incorrectly, that step is probably a mixture of 6 different steps.
Yeah.
And how do you know where? Yeah.
Because what we're getting back to this idea of variation is, sometimes your system could have zero throughput. Sometimes a step in your system could have zero throughput. Sometimes it could have one. Maybe some days it could have 50, right? I mean, as Pratik was saying, depending on what time frame you're looking at, you are going to have variation in your data. It's not well, maybe we will. It's not oh gosh darn, look at that, Pratik. You will have variation in your data. You will. You will, right? It's just a fact of life. It's intrinsic to nature. You will have variation in your data. And so now once there's variation in your data, now you have to say, well, okay, this step is 3 plus or minus 2. And this next step is 4 plus or minus 3. Which one of those is the slowest one, right? If we take that variation into account. So then you go to cycle time. And this is, I think, why Steve Tendon says, well, okay, look at average cycle time. I think, again, I could be wrong here. And so, when Steve and I were having this conversation, of course, I threw the Flaw of Averages book at him. I'm like, average cycle time, really? I mean, that's potentially the worst metric you could, well, the worst statistic you could choose is average, right? Average. And we had a long conversation about average and the problem with averages. Again, you've got the problem of variation. But then I was like, the ultimate problem with averages is, they're easily skewed by extreme outliers, and anybody who has run any type of knowledge work process knows from time to time, you are going to get a step in your process. A step in your process will see some type of weird behavior, some type of extreme outlier. It just will happen, right? Classic example I use in my classes is, a validation step in my process that normally should take 5 minutes took 120 days because it turned out that it required a legal sign off. I mean, this kind of stuff is going to happen. And so Steve's answer was, and I'm by the way, I'm not trying to denigrate Steve, because I think he's a smart guy. I think he's a reasonable guy, and I don't think he's acting from bad motivation or anything like that. But Steve's answer was, well, okay, well, you just remove those extreme outliers. This is the point. That sound you hear is Stewart rolling over in his grave, right? When you say, oh, we just remove those extreme outliers. Number one, what constitutes an extreme outlier? Number two, if you have an extreme outlier, that's probably where all the signal is, right? So the last thing we want to be doing is removing the thing in our process that has signal. So that's when people come along, and that's when we get the third answer that I've had. Sorry for this rant. I hope this is interesting for people. It's interesting for me. Pratik, are you bored yet? I don't know.
It was like 5 minutes ago.
Okay. So that's where we get to the third answer. It's like, well, if you can't spot what the bottleneck is or what the constraint is, we'll talk about constraints and bottlenecks maybe in a second if anybody cares. Well, if you can't spot where the constraint is, then you just choose it. You choose it, and then, okay, so let me get this straight. We are going to purposefully de-optimize our system just so we can use a theory. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. So all of this is leading to why the theory and then by the way, the fundamental reason why I personally don't think that theory of constraints is applicable is, if you read that paper that I talked about, Eli Goldrat's Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. I think it's the very last paragraph, or the very last 2 paragraphs of that paper. And he says, Okay, you know what? This, theory of constraints is really meant for, for manufacturing. If you're in a more project-based world and or a world where you have a flow efficiency of greater than 15%, theory of constraints is probably not applicable for you. You probably, and kudos to Eli for stating his assumptions and for stating for stating where it works and what it doesn't work. I'm a big admirer of him from that perspective. I would argue that any halfway decent agile team does have a greater than 15% flow efficiency. People freak out when I say that, but I know Pratik, the teams that you've led, the teams that I've led, their flow efficiency may have not been great, but I'm sure it was greater than 15%. Now we could talk about flow efficiency as a metric too, but right, I don't know. Would you agree with that statement too?
I would say it would be at worst closer to 50 than 15.
Yeah. So given all that stuff, I've just never seen the utility of theory of constraints when you've got so many other better things like the theory of variation, like Little's law, like just basic queuing theory. I just think those are so much more applicable in our world than the theory of constraints. So here endeth the lesson, I guess. I don't know. That's in a nutshell, in what, 10 minutes or less. That's why I'm just not a fan of theory. I don't know. Pratik, you have anything to add to that?
Well, in that same paper, I think Goldwright also mentions that the constraint will constantly move in that world.
Hmm.
In the project world, the constraint's constantly moving. So that's another piece that he throws in, which I think is very true for us. Like for any given item moving through your system, where it gets stuck, where the big constraint for it is, could be anywhere.
Yeah. So pick Pratik. That's the one I can't get over, is when they're like, well, if you can't spot it, you just pick one. I just cannot get over that. Somebody said that to me with a straight face. Again, I don't know if that's proper theory of constraints thinking. I don't know, but somebody actually said that to me with a straight face. Hey, if you don't know, you just pick.
Ugh. Well, I think this is where I think Steve Tanner would completely agree with us on this. Is the easiest way to spot where to take constrained action is look at aging and find out where things are aging and go take action there.
Right. And the language I would use to tweak that is it's not necessarily constraint action, it's variation action, right? I mean, it's like because our system is dominated by variation, it's better to understand variation and respond to that. Everybody can see my bias in the Shewhart and Deming tradition than it is, I think, in the Goldratt tradition. That's my 2 cents. So that's what I believe.
I'm looking through more comments. There's a question around global economics, which I am going to ignore because pursuant to an earlier discussion, we are not experts in global economics, so I would not venture answers there. Statistics. Joanna wants to know why we more rant around statistics. I think we've done a little bit of that.
we can move to that. And you're probably better suited to talk about that than I am. Although I will jump in. I should just say I don't know if I told you, I just reread The Flaw of Averages, and you and I should talk offline about some things that came up when I was rereading it. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, it's and again, Flaw of Averages is the definitive guide for this, right? Most statistics that we are taught in college are hacks that were developed before we had machines that could record, process, and sample data the way we can now. In fact, if everything that's led to all the AI stuff now is the fact that we're able to record all this data, analyze it, sample from it, and figure out the connections. That because we have that capability, because we have the capability of actually using real data, using things like averages, like probability distributions, standard deviations, using all those kind of falls on its place because you can actually use real data. That's just one of the points. The bigger point is all these mathematical hacks, when you take a statistics class, they are taught as if they are mathematical facts, not mathematical hacks. The flaws behind these are never explored. It's all like you do this and you'll get an answer, and that is a good answer. And then you go out into the real world and you start using those hacks, and we are all surprised. I was surprised that they don't work because we were taught that this is fact instead of this is a shortcut to do things.
Yeah, so getting back to that first point, imagine you're in 1700s Europe or even early 1800s Europe, and the only way to do math is you've got a bunch of sheets of paper and like a feather, right, with an ink cup or whatever that you're dipping your feather in, and now you're trying to do all of these kind of advanced mathematics, writing this stuff out by hand. Of course, you're not going to work with the raw data. Of course, you're going to want to look for some shortcut or something. Jump in. You want to jump in?
Oh, finish, and then I'll make you really happy with an example.
Right. Of course. And so that's why the normal distribution was made up. It shocks people to know this. The normal distribution does not exist in nature. You can't go anywhere in nature and find a normal distribution or a Weibull distribution or a gamma distribution or a Bird distribution. You can't do it. They don't exist because they are at best approximations of natural phenomena. Right. That's the best. And the reason they did that is because it's much easier to work with the mathematics of the normal distribution than it is to work with the actual raw data, as Pratik was saying. We don't have computers back then. Help me out.
No, this is okay. So everybody out there, Dan's gonna get really happy right now because I'm gonna talk about the one thing that he constantly picks on me for. Whenever I set up travel plans, I tend to do everything that I tell people not to do. Recently, I went home to India, and I had a 1 hour layover in Heathrow. Now, when I looked at the flight from Miami to Heathrow, it told me that usually that flight gets there half an hour early. I was like, that 1 hour layover is actually an hour and a half layover. I should be able to easily make it. If I'm just using traditional statistics, on average, getting there half an hour early works for me. Now, turns out my flight going out got delayed by an hour and a half. So getting to Heathrow, my delay at Heathrow ended up being 9 hours because they had to put me on the next flight, which made me miss my next flight. And it all added up to being a total of about 14-hour delay in getting to my end destination. Looking at that whole series from a traditional statistical model, you would probably say that everything should be fine. Like taking an average, even taking a standard deviation of how late or early that flight gets to Heathrow from Miami, everything should be fine. But if you look back for the last 100 times that flight has gone there, you'll probably be able to tell by looking at actual discrete data, what percentage of chance do I have of actually making that connection? That's why we keep calling traditional statistics a hack, to say putting in those parameters will give you one answer where you'll be very sure things will work, but putting in real data might give you very different answers.
Yeah, and this is the person who really opened my eyes to this, and I sound like a broken record, but I'm going to talk about him because I think he's probably been the most influential in my thinking over the past 15 years. Is Dr. Donald Wheeler, and if you go to his website spcpress.com, SB as in statistical process control, even though he really doesn't talk about SPC on that site, but anyway, it's called spcpress.com. He's got a ton of articles about this exact topic, about how the normal distribution is a continuous function that extends out to infinity on both ends, right? And your data is not infinite. Your data is finite. And so it really matters what's happening in those tail areas. Not only does it really matter what's happening in that middle mound shape, but it really matters what's happening in that tail area. And if you have a finite set of data and you're trying to use an infinite function to approximate that finite data, you are sooner or later you're going to run into trouble. The thing is, as Pratik just said, given all the computing techniques, numerical techniques that we have right now, you never need to. Why would you ever try to transform your data into a normal distribution, or try to fit your data to a normal distribution, or any one of these other distributions, when you've got the data itself? You don't need this stuff anymore. As you can see, we're kind of on a soapbox now, but this is rather the point. So anybody, and I'm so tempted to name names, but I'm not going to name names, but anybody out there who has published anything about taking your data and fitting it to one of these well-known probability distributions, and maybe even going further and saying you can make inferences about your process based on the shape parameters of your distribution, right away they have no clue what they're talking about. They have absolutely no clue what they're talking about, because of all the stuff that Pratik just mentioned. It's because math. We got to get those t-shirts, right? Because we were taught this in statistics class in college, so therefore it must be good. It must be what we use, because that's what we were taught. Turns out it's all wrong.
All right. I'm seeing a few more questions here. I'm going to move. I'm going to switch topics just a little bit here. There's one about right-sizing spikes and research topics in code refactoring.
You do that one.
Okay. So the question is how to handle spikes and code refactoring to have right-sizing when there are more unknowns into these topics. The team has no idea how to slice it for their SLE.
Yep.
I like to approach this in two different ways. One is I like to say spikes don't exist, because everything you're doing is technically a spike. Everything you're doing has some sort of an acceptance criteria that we need to get this done, and then you're working an item through to find out, did we get that done in the correct way? But that's a bit of a jump for folks. An assumption I made in that, and this gets to the second thing, is whatever we're working on has some sort of an acceptance criteria. It's not completely open-ended. So for example, refactoring code. Well, refactoring code to what end and in what module? Do we want to make this faster? Do we want to make this more maintainable? How will we know that this thing is done? Once we have an idea of how will we know that this thing is done, we could probably enumerate some acceptance criteria. Now that we have my guess is most teams don't have acceptance criteria for their spikes and refactoring stories. If you put acceptance criteria to it, then it becomes so much easier to go. We usually get things done in 6 days or less. Well, of these 10 acceptance criteria, which three can we put in as one story? Which can we put in this next one? I think most of the time, and we see this not just with spikes, we often see this with epics and initiatives, higher level elements too. They do not have an acceptance criteria that needs to be met in order to call this item done. Once you actually put that acceptance criteria in, only then I believe you have a shot at actually slicing this, as right-sizing this using your SLE. Otherwise, the reason you're not able to slice it is because we haven't defined how this thing will be called done, and then people can just keep adding things to it. Dan, anything to add to that?
I thought you were going. Do you want to say something a little bit about that last bit, kind of the just-in-time nature of this too, right?
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? I thought that's where you were going to go.
Oh, well, a lot of times you're starting this work and you're going, okay, I'm just going to keep working through this as
right.
and figuring
because
out
we don't know, because especially if it's a spike, right? We don't know, right? I mean, right?
Yeah, it goes back to the variability thing that we were talking about earlier, and it's very easy when you don't know to keep adding work to it instead of actually managing that variability and going, hey, we've spent 5 days on this thing. Is the investment in this worth it? Are we actually getting what we want out of this? Putting some sort of urgency around it to go, we need to get something out of this in 5 days or less. I think that leads to better slicing of this work.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if I mean, I think a reasonable assumption, I think what you're saying, I think a reasonable assumption going in is to treat these things like everything else, right? I mean, our system produces stuff that gets done in 5 days or less, right? Or whatever.
Mhm.
And use the exact same principles that we talk about all the time. Okay, bring it in, pay attention to aging, slice it if you need it. I think that's a reasonable place to start. Over time, you might acknowledge that, hey, maybe these spikes are different, or maybe these, whatever things are different, and so maybe we need to treat them as different work item types with different SLEs and things like that, and that's okay, if the system justifies that, if the economics justify that, and if the data justifies it, so but you'll still have this problem of needing to understand, okay, well, how much age is too much age, and how big is too big, and and things like that. So yeah, so just because it's like an unknown known or an unknown unknown doesn't mean we get to just keep working on it forever, and it just takes as long as it does. You've still got to work within kind of the principles of flow management that we talk about, right? I don't know if that's the right way of saying it, but
Yeah, it's not any different. That's why I said the first thing, that spike, that refactoring should not be treated any different from
Yep.
any other item.
Yep. Your
You're
system is your
going in-
system. Yep.
Yeah, you're going in, most of the time you're going in not knowing what the result will be.
Yep. Could be it's different. It could be, but
Yeah.
All right, next one. Thanks for that question. That was a good question, by the way.
Yeah. This one is more for you, Dan. This is around SLE.
Okay.
I understand that the first tool that to look at when you want to choose an SLE is a scatter plot. What do you think about using as a support the process behavior chart to help you better understand what can be expected?
So wow, how do I not launch into another dissertation? So couple of things. The aim of the process behavior chart is potentially slightly different, although it can be used the way that you're talking about it. I don't want to discount that, because it certainly could be used to come up with an SLE. I think it comes down to, dare I say it, good enough. I mean, for most of the data that we come across, for most of the economic settings that we come across, throwing your data on a scatter plot is probably a good enough first approximation of where you maybe should be setting an SLE. If for no other reason, you can look at those different percentiles. Because who knows? Maybe you want to plan to the 50th percentile. Maybe you want to plan to the 70th percentile, 85th percentile. Right? You've got a bunch of just different percentiles. The process behavior chart is only slightly different in that it's just really trying to characterize the overall performance of your system. And all Sheward is saying is, hey, you've got a 99 point whatever percent chance of your data falling between these two limits. And it should be reasonable for you to expect that your data is going to fall between these limits. And so while you certainly could set an SLE to be that upper control limit, that's the absolute worst case scenario. And that's really meant more to talk about a potential signal of, is our system changing, rather than necessarily day-to-day managing is stuff getting told. Now, one thing I would say is that I would think it'd be reasonable to validate any SLE that we've set, to validate that data in a process behavior chart, because if your data is showing some clear signs of potential, I shouldn't say clear signs, signs of potential signal, maybe that SLE isn't valid. Maybe there's some improvements that we can make to our process. So make those improvements, study the data, and see should our SLE be different. So I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but I think they're slightly different. The charts have slightly different goals for what you're trying to do. And like I said, in most cases, it's been my experience anyway, in most cases, you can get away with a scatter plot for what we're trying to do. I don't know. Can you say that better?
one potential from an service level expectation perspective, one potential drawback of the process behavior chart is you cannot really have that conversation of how much risk are you willing to take. You cannot have a conversation of, hey, I want to take a 30% risk. Okay, so that's a 70th percentile on the SLE or on the scatter plot. Like that becomes a much harder conversation with the process behavior chart.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, maybe stated a slightly different way, or maybe stated a completely different way. This might not be what you're talking about, but if an item breaches, if we set a service level expectation and an item breaches that service level expectation, that doesn't mean that your process is misbehaving in and of itself. That's not what that means. If an item breaches that upper control limit, now that's when we have an economically justified potential signal that, hey, our process is not behaving the way that we expect it to. So is that kind of what
Yeah,
you're
that's because you could exceed the expected performance without your process misbehaving.
right?
Because your expected performance could be set up as a negotiation with your customers to say, your customers say, we're okay with you being wrong 30% of the time. That does not mean that when an item exceeds, that does not mean your process is out of control.
Apropos of absolutely nothing, I was just reminded of a conversation we're having way back when with a certain senior director who will remain nameless, and he was frustrated because his team had achieved. Remember, his team had achieved something like, I don't know, 22 items in the previous sprint.
Oh,
but this sprint they were only planning for 18, and he was like, they should be able to do more than they did in the last sprint, right? And he had no really feel for, for variation and thing. And he was really angry. He was really upset about, and he came to us because he wanted us to
go tell them,
to kick him in the ass, right? And I was like, oh yeah, we're not going to do that. Okay, next question.
There's one around Monte Carlo which I do not understand really well. I think I do, but let me see if you understand this better than I do, Dan.
Okay.
This is, any thoughts on Monte Carlo versus using current task estimate and task completion rate, preferred by Eric Beckner at Microsoft, I'm assuming. Seems the latter doesn't lend itself to bounding the estimate probabilistically, but is good if you don't have a long history.
And work tracks. Okay. So whoever posted that, I would love a clarification in terms of what you mean by task. That's one of those words that I think gets overloaded pretty quickly. If by task, are you meaning value item, or are you meaning kind of more like, we've taken a story, we've broken it down into individual things that need to happen, but when we put all those individual things together, now something is delivered. I don't know. Do you want to take a shot at that, or do you?
I'm gonna make the assumption that it's value item, so that just for the sake of it, and just because.
So if I can say, whoever posted that question, what Pratik's about to answer, caveat it with, if you mean task as those really, really small, like checklist type items, what Pratik's saying here is not going to be valid for you. But anyway, go ahead, Pratik.
Yeah. When so if you have a current task estimate, which I am assuming you're saying this thing that we want to do is made up of 20 value items, something like that, and the rate at which we're getting these done. Really what you have, that rate is really throughput, and the current task estimate is essentially this amount of work we need to get through. That is the default setup. Those two parameters are the default setup for a Monte Carlo win. Essentially, we see what is the rate at which we're getting things done, push that into Monte Carlo, and then say we had to do 20 things. When will these 20 things get done? I don't know the method you're talking about. I don't know if it's any different from that. It probably is, but using the exact same inputs, assuming my definition of those inputs is the same as your definition of those inputs, we can get a probabilistic answer from Monte Carlo, and you don't really have to change much else. You'll get that answer. That's again assuming that these are value items, assuming that that's what we meant when we said current task estimate. Because when we talk about, whenever we are working with any customer, that's the question they want to answer. Hey, I have this feature. When can I get this to my customers? And that's where we talk about how do you figure out how big that feature is, and how do you use Monte Carlo to answer when will that feature be done.
So I read this as maybe even a data quality thing. It's like, because he's saying we don't have a ton of data on task completion rate. So how do I use Monte Carlo simulation? I know. Can you speak to? I would want you to speak to two things. One, what if we don't have enough data? But number two, what even if we do have enough data? What are some things we have to worry about when we talk about completion rate? Can you just cover those very quickly?
First, if we don't have enough data, one question is, what does enough data mean? Frankly, for us, if you have 10 or more data points, you're probably in a good enough space to get started. So if you have less than that for any reason, it won't take you too long to get to 10 or more, given that you're managing flow, given that you're getting things done. The other thing that will happen as soon as you start managing flow is you're going to figure out what are these items that are taking too long. Because I see that talking about long task ages already. This is where a second problem comes in, where we can say, oh, we'll get 20 things done in this month. But because some of your items have such long ages, one of those items could take 2 months or 3 months. And that will throw away all your Monte Carlo predictions. Because you said 20 things done, this thing was 20 things. Why isn't it done yet? Well, because 2 of these things took 6 months. This is one of the reasons why Dan and I kind of keep harping on aging, because that is the way you actively manage flow. Once you're doing that, not just Monte Carlo, any method you use will give you a much better answer than when you're not doing that.
It is better to do it than to not. Truer words were never spoken, Pratik. We're going to call that Pratik's law. Okay, but what about? I guess where I was coming at it more from the perspective. Let's say we do have limit, but let's say we have enough data. Let's say we have 20 data points, and let's say our team's historical throughput is for those over those 20 days is anywhere between 0 and 8. It's like, sometimes there's a 0, sometimes there's a 1, sometimes there's a 6, sometimes there's an 8, sometimes there's another 0, right? Is it reasonable to say, well, and say we only have 20 data points? Is it reasonable to say, well, we've only seen this data between 0 and 8? Is that what we should plan on in the future? Because it sounds like that might, the way I read this, he's asking, or she's asking, or whoever is asking, that might limit us probabilistically, because well, just because we've only seen 0 to 8 in the past doesn't mean we're only going to see 0 to 8 in the future. Does that?
That's.
What would you say to that?
This kind of goes back to the statistics things we were talking about. Our approach would be, if you've only seen 0 to 8, well, let's sample only from that 0 to 8. That is the reality we have right now. Now, this is where our other favorite thing comes in, which is continuous forecasting. We don't just make this forecast once. We keep forecasting over and over again. If for any reason a 10 shows up, great. That's now a part of our model. Our reforecasting will include that in that model. But if in the past we've only seen 0 to 8, let's only plan on that. Right. Yeah, I was going to get into cricket, but I'm not going to get into cricket.
Yeah, it's not getting into cricket. We've only got 15 minutes left, Pratik. But by the way, so I mean, this is why we talk about there is a mathematical justification for talking about, hey, you need somewhere between 10 and 20 points. This is exactly what Pratik is getting to, is because assuming you're running a stable system, which again, I mean, that's a big assumption, but a lot of times it's an okay assumption to make. But assuming you're running a stable system, if you've got, say, between 10 and 20 data points, the chances of you getting a data point outside of that, whatever those 10 to 20 points are, the chances of you getting something outside is very, very low. It's very, very, very small. I mean, it quickly, I think at 10 data points, it's 90 something. Yeah.
Yeah.
And once you get up to 20, it's like 99.999% chance that you won't see something, again, assuming you're running a stable system, and you're sampling a certain way and whatever. But that's why we talk. Well, that's why we talk about having a certain amount of data. Usually, the problem is you've got too much data rather than too little, and so now we have to figure out from the too much data what's that subset that characterizes what we're trying to forecast. That's a whole other conversation. What's the next?
Yeah, I think we've got time for just a couple more. This one should be quick. You mentioned that normal distribution doesn't exist. What about log normal?
Yeah. For all of those named continuous distributions, and even the named discrete distributions, yeah, they don't exist. I know it. I got laughed at once when I used the exact terminology that Pratik used when I say that these are mathematical hacks. But that's exactly what they are. Now, in certain situations, they're very useful mathematical hacks, but they are hacks nonetheless. So the question we need to constantly ask ourselves is, understanding that these are hacks. All of these distributions are hacks. Do they still represent a reasonable approximation? The problem with heading down that path, and this is where I'm going to channel my inner Dr. Wheeler, is the problem with heading down that path is you're constantly going to have to ask yourself, did I choose the right distribution? Did I choose the right distribution? Did I choose the right distribution? Because, and Pratik, you maybe know this better than I do, when you start fitting your data to a distribution, you're essentially going to make a guess, because I think there's always going to be more than one and potentially infinite distributions that you could choose. Is that
exactly.
That's correct, right?
You could think about all the named distributions and all the parameters that can go into those named distributions. There are an infinite number of distributions you can fit your data to.
Right. So why even go down that path if you don't have to? Because remember, your process was not generated by some fancy, some giant distribution in the sky, right? Your process is not generating data. It's like, oh, well, I got to follow a normal distribution. And so if I generate this data point, that's going to invalidate a normal distribution. So I'm going to make sure. Your process doesn't do that, right? Your process is messy and nasty and ugly, and your data is going to be messy and nasty and ugly. So embrace your inner ugliness. I say this to Pratik all the time. Embrace your inner ugliness and just use that raw data, because that's your process.
All right. This might be the last one for today. This is a good one to finish on, I think. Andre asks, what kind of financial and economic metrics can be connected to flow metrics? Background, talking to CFO, budget, etc.
I if I were to take a shot at this, I would say that I think the way I would answer is, I don't think that's been determined. I don't think it's something that I've been pretty sick of me talking about this stuff. But for the past 20 years, I've been trying to figure out a link between, say, like cycle time and profit, or cycle time and revenue, or throughput and profit, and throughput and revenue. I've worked with a couple of people who've kind of gotten close, but I don't think it's happened. But what I appreciate about that question is, I fundamentally believe that we need to be able to talk about this stuff to CFOs, and we need to speak the language of CFOs if we are going to get, as far down the path as I think we need to get with this stuff. I fundamentally believe, I think you believe this too, I believe that higher throughput and lower cycle time will help your top line and will help your bottom line. I fundamentally believe that. Have I proven it? No, I haven't proven. I don't know that anybody out there has proven it. If anybody out there has, I would love to hear it. But I don't know. I don't know that there's any proof. I don't know. That's how I would answer it. I guess bottom line, I don't think that tie has been made, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think we have some guesses, but that's what they are. They're guesses, and they are, as of right now, not invalidated guesses, but also not validated guesses. There's no economic proof. There's no theoretical proof that they work, but we have guesses like the longer things take, the more investment you've made in them. Well, that we've tried to throw numbers at it. We don't have a proven way of saying that yet. The more things you've delivered, the more potential value you've delivered. Again, it's a guess. We don't have proof of it.
I was just going to mention, I've seen cost of delay pop up in some of the comments here, and this is where we have to be careful, is because those of you who haven't read it, Pratik and I published a paper called "Don't Be a Ditka." It's out there on Medium somewhere, somewhere. I don't know where it is. We could maybe post it or whatever. Cost of delay is one of those. It's one of those metrics you have to be really, 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 really careful, because if you know cost of delay, then yes, you can use cost of delay to maybe tie these things together. But the thing is, you don't know cost of delay. Most of the times, the vast majority of times, you don't know what cost. You might think you do, but you don't. And that's what this paper is all about, because all the inputs into cost of delay, especially if we talk about CD3, cost of delay divided by duration, lifetime profits is a random variable. Cycle time is a random variable. So the inputs that you put into these calculations are random variables, and so you can't make, whenever you have this. This is the one thing I love about the Flaw of Averages, the book of Flaw of Averages, is you can't use a single number to describe a distribution. You can't. I mean, you can, but that's how you get into the Flaw of Averages. So yeah, I mean, maybe that's a whole other conversation we can do next time about cost of delay, because I know it gets tossed around. And by the way, for the record, what SAFe calls cost of delay is not cost of delay. And that's not from me. That's from Don Reinertson, right? I'm quoting Don Reinertson on this one. I don't know. Do you have anything to say?
I had something when you were talking about this earlier, and then I totally lost it. Well, cost of delay is that Ditka paper. We did a lot of that through simulation. We did a lot of that making assumptions around value, assumptions about cycle time, or generating values and cycle times at random. If we were to really answer this question, what we would need is someone to actually track value, to actually track cycle time. And if we're able to get to that, we might be able to answer this question. Right. We might actually be able to find the link.
But these are questions that we posed in that paper, is how do you really track value, right? So, I mean, it's like if we look at StreamYard here, we're using StreamYard here, if we were to add a feature to StreamYard, I don't know if you can think of a feature, I don't know, AI transcription. I don't know. They might already have that, but I'm just going to use that, right? So it's got, we can add AI transcription, and our users go up, and our paid users go up after I add that feature. Can we attribute all of that incremental revenue to that new feature? Or is it because we had AI transcription and the ability to chat? That's why people are using. Or if we had AI transcription and the ability to chat and the ability to stream to Facebook, right? Maybe that's why people are buying, right? So it's an almost impossible problem, I think, to solve. Like any individual feature, what is the true value quote unquote value added to a product just by incrementally delivering a feature? And by the way, we haven't even scratched the surface, or we haven't even talked about things like CapEx and OpEx and
right.
Taxes and all of that other cost of capital and all of that other stuff that would go into it as well. So this is a really, 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 really hard problem to solve, and that's probably why it hasn't been solved yet. But I'm hoping for the sake of our industry, we will solve it at some point.
Well, I think that's the end of the question. Now, Joanna has one that will require its own episode, I think.
Yeah.
How to manage management's need for prediction against real life.
Yeah. And just very, very quickly, just on that, very sympathetic too. Management is asking fair questions, right? If they want to know how long is this thing going to take, how much is it going to cost, those are fair questions because they're trying to manage risk, and so they're trying to get an understanding of what's going on here. Those are fair questions. Now their expectation around answers may not be fair, but the questions themselves are fair. So maybe that's we could start with that. A little bit later. So I know, Pratik, wrap us up. Final word.
Well, I just want to thank everyone who showed up, everyone who asked questions, everyone who interacted. This was our experiment in seeing how this goes. Literally, as we were starting, we were like, should we hit start? Because I don't know what will happen when I hit start. But thank you for indulging us in this experiment, and thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks everybody for taking time out of your day. Hopefully we'll see you in another future episode of Drunk Agile. And if you liked what you saw here, let us know, and we'll try to do another Drunk Agile live at some point in the future as well. So thanks everyone. Have a great day. Have a great week. See you in the next episode. Bye everyone.
Yeah, folks. Okay.